German shepherd dragged a Navy SEAL to the shoreline and wouldn't let him leave. Under a fallen tree, he found a waterproof bag stuffed with sonar logs, secret coordinates, and a USB that shouldn't exist. The audio on it cut off mid-sentence, like someone realized they were being heard. Minutes later, a small boat drifted in with a young sonar technician,
Come on, Juno.
half frozen,
I've got you.
wrists scraped
Stay
raw,
with me.
whispering, "They followed me." In town, the most respected man smiled warmly, yet the dog stepped between them like a warning from God. Now the cabin is being watched, the lake is hiding something heavy, and Graham has one question. Why did this evidence find him? Comment what city you're watching from, or share your thoughts after the story. And please like and subscribe so we can hit 1,000 subs. Spring arrived in the north, the way a cautious god enters a room, quietly, as if apologizing for the cold it hadn't yet chased away. Lake Superior lay wide and bright beneath a pale blue sky, its surface glittering with the kind of light that looked gentle from far away and knife-sharp up close. The wind smelled like thawing pine and metal, like old snow surrendering one reluctant inch at a time. Morning should have felt like relief. For Graham Sloan, relief was a word other people used. He was 38, 6'1", built the way a working man is built when the body has learned efficiency instead of vanity. Lean muscle, tight shoulders, nothing showy. His face was clean-shaven, always. No beard, no stubble, just a close shave that left the sharp geometry of him exposed. Square jaw, high cheekbones, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile for more than a second. His hair was dark brown, cut in a military neatness that had softened over time. Just a touch longer than regulation, as if even his discipline had begun to fray at the edges. Wind and cold had weathered his fair skin into something tougher, sunlit but roughened. Northern air had a way of sanding people down. His eyes were a gray-blue that didn't settle, always scanning, like they expected the world to lunge. Graham wore the same outfit he wore nearly every day, because choosing clothes felt like choosing a future. A faded olive-gray tactical combat shirt clung to him in the way old fabric clings after too many washes. The cuffs were worn thin, the shoulders lightly scuffed, the color dulled by weather and repetition. His combat pants were earth brown leaning toward moss, knees roughened, cargo pockets sagging slightly from use. Work boots, military issued once, now softened by time and miles. A battered military watch sat on his wrist, the kind that kept going even when the people wearing them didn't. He told himself he dressed like this because he worked by the water, repairing dock hardware, fixing mooring lines, replacing rusted brackets. That was true, but there were other truths in the seams. Beside him moved Coda. Coda was a German shepherd in his prime, 4, maybe 5, all athletic balance and quiet authority. His coat was classic working dog color, rich tan along the legs and chest, with a deep black saddle down his back like a shadow that chose to stay. Double-layer fur, thick and weatherproof, not glossy like a show dog, but healthy in the honest way of animals that live outdoors and mean it. His ears stood upright, always listening. His eyes were amber brown, alert but steady, eyes that made people feel seen, and if they were hiding something, slightly uneasy. Coda didn't bark often. He didn't need to. He communicated in posture and breath, in the subtle tilt of his head, in the way he placed his body between Graham and whatever he didn't trust. Coda's loyalty wasn't loud. It was constant. Like gravity, they were at the edge of the marina that morning, where a line of small docks fingered into the lake. Graham knelt near a mooring post, tightening a bracket that had loosened over winter. The metal squealed when he put weight on the wrench. Coda paced once, twice, then stopped. Graham felt it before he looked up, that shift in the world that happens when an animal's instincts snap to attention. Coda's body went still, ears forward, tail low but not tucked. Not fear, focus. "What is it?" Graham rasped. His voice was rougher than it should have been for a man his age, scarred by years of cold air and old smoke and nights where he spoke to no one. He didn't talk much anymore. When he did, it sounded like gravel finding shape. Coda turned his head toward the tree line, where driftwood and uprooted roots lay tangled along the shoreline. Then he looked back at Graham with an expression that wasn't human, but carried the same weight as a sentence. "Come." Graham exhaled, through his nose, a humorless half-laugh. "You pulling rank on me now?" Coda didn't blink. That was the thing about Coda. He never begged, never dramatized. When he insisted, it was because the world had already made up its mind that something mattered. Graham stood, wiped his hands on his pants, and followed. They walked along the shoreline where ice had recently retreated, leaving wet stones that glinted like broken glass. The wind picked up and snapped at Graham's sleeves. Coda moved with controlled urgency, leading him to a fallen tree near the waterline. Then Coda stopped and sniffed hard at the exposed roots. Graham's brain tried to offer the usual explanations. Fish, fox, old bait. But he caught it too. A faint chemical tang. Plastic, oil, not the clean oil of boat engines. Something different, something sealed. Coda pawed at the roots, carefully, like he didn't want to damage whatever was hidden. Then he stepped back, looked at Graham again. Graham crouched and reached in. His fingers brushed nylon, slick and cold. He pulled, and a waterproof bag slid out from under the roots, coated in mud and lake water. The kind of bag kayakers used, or divers, or people who didn't want questions. Graham stared at it. His hands began to shake, not violently, not obvious, but enough that the bag rustled in his grip. He hated that, hated the tremor, hated how his body sometimes remembered fear even when his mind pretended it didn't. Coda sat beside him, close enough that Graham could feel the dog's warmth through the wind. "You find treasure now?" Graham muttered, trying to keep it light. Coda tilted his head once, as if unimpressed by sarcasm. Graham opened the bag. Inside were 3 things, neatly wrapped: a damp notebook in a plastic sleeve, a folded map with hand-marked coordinates, and a USB drive sealed in a small pouch. No wallet, no name, no phone. The notebook's pages were filled with numbers, diagrams, and short, technical notes. Sonar readings, depth profiles, timestamps. Graham wasn't a sonar technician, but he had spent enough time in operations to recognize patterns. The map showed a section of the lake and a cluster of marks near a buoy labeled 9. Graham's mouth tightened. He could have walked away. He knew that. He could have put the bag back under the roots, pretended he'd never touched it, gone back to tightening bolts and living small. He wanted to. He wanted to live a life where morning was just morning. But his eyes caught something in the notebook, an inconsistency that made his pulse change tempo. Lines that should have matched didn't. Timestamps that overlapped when they shouldn't. Routes that doubled back, not in a way that made sense for maintenance boats or fishermen. "Ghost lanes," he whispered without meaning to. Coda's ears flicked at the sound. Ghost lanes. Routes that existed on paper but not in daylight. Routes that belonged to people who moved at night. Graham swallowed. The lake breeze felt colder. He took out the USB, turned it over in his palm. It was ordinary, cheap, the kind you could buy at a gas station, and yet it sat there like an oracle's tooth. Coda stood and turned in a slow circle, sniffing the air, then the ground, then the bag. His posture was still calm, but there was a new tension along his shoulders, a quiet warning. Graham looked up. "You smell someone?" Coda didn't answer in barks. He answered by moving closer to Graham's left side, aligning his body so that if anything came from the trees, Coda would meet it first. That protective instinct was both comforting and terrifying, because it meant Coda believed there was a first. Graham took the bag back to the dock office, an old, sun-faded shed with a workbench, a cheap laptop, and a window that looked out over the water like a watchful eye. He shut the door behind them and set the notebook down. Coda lay near, the doorway, head up, eyes alert. Graham plugged the USB into the laptop. The screen flickered. A folder opened. There were a few audio files, labeled only by dates and times. No names, no titles, just numbers, like someone didn't want these to be searched for. Graham clicked the most recent, static for half a second. Then a voice, male, controlled, not shouting. The kind of voice that believed it never needed to raise itself. "Don't let the technician notice," the voice said. "If they understand the data, then—" The audio cut off abruptly. Graham stared at the screen. His throat tightened in that old way, the way it did when his mind tried to climb out of the present. Because that sentence, cut in the middle, had the same shape as a memory. A warning interrupted, a plan that didn't finish speaking before the gunfire began. Coda rose from the floor. He walked to the window, ears forward. Graham felt the hair on his arms lift beneath his sleeves. He stood and joined the dog, peering out through the glass. Outside, the marina sat bright and innocent, sunlight bouncing off water, gulls crying like they owned the sky. But on the far edge of the parking area near the trees, a vehicle sat half-hidden, a dark pickup. Not moving, not leaving, just there. Graham's pulse thudded once, heavier than it should have. He tried to tell himself it belonged to a fisherman, a local, someone waiting for someone, but Coda's low rumble said otherwise. Not a growl, not aggression, a warning, a sound deep in the chest, the kind dogs make when they are being polite while preparing to be violent. Graham backed away from the window, heart steadying into something colder and sharper. He could walk away. He could unplug the USB, put it back, bury the bag again, pretend he'd never heard that voice. But the lake outside was too bright for the darkness he'd just touched. It made the contrast unbearable. And there was something else, something he couldn't explain without sounding foolish. As Graham reached to close the laptop, Coda suddenly pressed his nose to the notebook and huffed once, hard. Graham paused. "What?" Coda nudged the notebook again, more insistently. His focus wasn't on the bag or the USB now. It was on a single page in the sonar logs. Graham leaned closer. On that page, someone had drawn a small symbol in the margin. Not a name, not a signature. A simple mark, a circle with a short line beneath it, like a buoy drawn by someone in a hurry. Graham's fingers hovered over it. His mind replayed the map. Buoy 9, the cluster of marks, the sonar anomalies. Coda looked at him, amber eyes steady. It wasn't just instinct. It felt like instruction. Like the dog was saying, "This is the door. This is where the story begins. This is the place you can't pretend you didn't see." Graham's mouth twisted into something almost like a smile. Thin, tired, unwilling. "Well," he murmured, voice low. "Congratulations, Coda." Coda blinked slowly. You found the one thing I'm terrible at ignoring. Outside, the pickup remained still. Inside, the notebook lay open like an accusation. And Graham Sloan, who had spent so long trying to live quietly, felt the lake's bright morning light tilt, just slightly, into something that didn't belong to morning at all. He shut the laptop, carefully, quietly. Then he looked at Coda. "Let's go home," he said. Coda didn't relax. Not yet. He rose and followed, close to Graham's leg, a shadow with a heartbeat, while the lake glittered behind them like nothing in the world had changed. But in Graham's chest, something old had shifted. A door, once welded shut, had begun to creak, and whatever waited on the other side had already smelled him coming. By noon, the lake looked almost kind. Sunlight scattered across Lake Superior in bright shards, turning the water into a field of broken mirrors. From a distance, it could fool a person into thinking the world was soft again. Winter's cruelty rinsed clean, spring arriving with open hands. Up close, the wind still had teeth. Graham Sloan kept his head down as he worked the marina, sleeves pulled tight over his wrists, boots planted on damp boards. The old tactical shirt clung to him like a second skin, faded olive gray, frayed at the cuffs, worn in a way that made it clear he didn't own clothes so much as he endured them. Every movement of his body was precise, economical, not stiff, not relaxed. Ready. Coda padded beside him in near silence, black and tan coat rippling under the light. The German shepherd moved with the calm of something that didn't need to prove its strength. 4 or 5 years old, prime, disciplined, watchful, his amber-brown eyes tracked the world in barks, ears twitching at distant gull cries, tail low but steady. Graham told himself he was returning to routine. Fix a hinge, replace a rusted cleat, check a mooring line. Pretend the last 24 hours had been nothing more than a bad dream and a misplaced bag. He didn't go back for the bag. He didn't open the laptop again. He didn't look at the map with buoy number 9 circled like a warning. He didn't, because he knew exactly what would happen if he did. His life had been built into a small, quiet shape on purpose. A cabin. A job that asked for hands, not stories. A dog that asked for presents, not promises. A man could survive like that. A man could almost heal. Then Coda stopped. It wasn't dramatic. No barking, no sprinting. Just a sudden stillness. Ears forward, nose lifted, body angling toward the water. That quiet shift was Coda's language. Something is wrong. Graham followed the dog's gaze. A small aluminum skiff drifted into the marina, mouth, bow dipping gently with the swell. No engine sound, no wake. Just slow, careless movement, as if the boat had been set loose and told to find its own ending. Graham's chest tightened. He didn't move at first. He watched, because watching was safer than acting. Then he saw the shape inside. A person. Curled low on the floor of the boat, like someone trying to disappear into metal and shadow. Graham's body moved before his thoughts finished arguing. He stepped onto the nearest dock finger and jogged along the wet boards, boots thudding. Coda ran beside him without being told, a shadow with a heartbeat. When Graham reached the skiff, he hooked a line around the bow cleat and pulled it in. The boat bumped the dock with a hollow clank. Inside was a woman. She was in her early 30s, slender in the way people get when they live on adrenaline and cold coffee, thin but not fragile. Dark blonde hair escaped a messy bun, strands stuck to her damp cheek. Her skin was pale with a gray-blue tint at the lips, the color of someone who'd been too long in cold air. Her hands were trembling, and her wrists were scraped raw. the shallow cuts bright red against numbed skin. Her jacket was soaked through, blue-gray and practical, the kind worn by people who work outside. A thin black turtleneck showed at the collar. Waterproof work pants, hiking boots with lake mud packed in the tread. She looked like someone who had tried to be prepared and still lost. Graham knelt, 2 fingers at her neck, finding a pulse. Fast, weak, hypothermia? Coda stepped closer and lowered his head near her face, sniffing once, then huffing softly, as if he'd recognized not her, but the story clinging to her. Graham's voice came out rough. "Ma'am, hey, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. A low sound left her throat, half breath, half apology. Graham cursed under his breath, not at her, but at himself, at the way life kept finding him like a thrown stone. He lifted her carefully. She was light, shockingly light, like the lake had been stealing weight from her while it tried to steal her warmth. Coda moved ahead to the small dock office, already at the door, already watching the world behind them. Not aggressive, protective, a guardian at the threshold. Inside, Graham laid the woman on a bench near the heater, stripped off her soaked jacket, and wrapped her in an old wool blanket that smelled faintly of wood smoke and dog. He grabbed a thermos from the shelf, poured warm water into a cup, and held it to her lips. "Small sips," he said. "Don't fight it." Her eyes opened more fully, hazel, bloodshot, sharp with fear. She took a tiny sip, then another. Her gaze snapped to Coda, who sat at the door, ears forward like he was listening to the world's heartbeat. The woman swallowed. "Dog?" "He won't hurt you," Graham said. "Not unless you give him a reason." Coda's tail thumped once, softly, as if agreeing with the terms. The woman tried to sit up. Graham pressed her shoulder down gently. "Stay," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the same tone he used with Coda, the tone of someone used to keeping things alive. She obeyed, then winced as her wrists shifted under the blanket. Graham noticed the pattern, scrapes on the inside of both wrists, like rope burn, like someone had pulled against restraints. His jaw tightened. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, as if names were dangerous. Then she exhaled. "Juno. Juno Hale." The way she said it, flat but careful, told him she'd learned to measure every word. "Okay, Juno," Graham said. "How did you end up drifting into my dock?" Her eyes flicked to the window, to the bright lake, to the gulls that didn't care about human fear. "I didn't," she started. Then her voice shook. Anger, embarrassment, cold. "I didn't drift." Graham waited. Juno swallowed, her throat moving hard. "I work sonar for the dredging project, environmental mapping, scanning, compliance stuff, the lake bed, the mud, the nothing to see here work." A bitter humor flashed in her eyes. The boring part that keeps contractors honest, supposedly. There was a small scar above her left eyebrow, thin and white, old. Her hands moved unconsciously to cover her wrists again, as if ashamed of them. "I saw something," she continued, voice lower now. "An anomaly. Not like rocks, not like a wreck. Something wrong. It was near a buoy, number 9. Graham's breathing slowed. He kept his face neutral, but inside him a memory stirred. Paper maps, grid lines, coordinates that didn't belong. "Buoy 9, he repeated. Juno nodded once. "I flagged it. I made notes. I did what I was trained to do." Coda's ears flicked at the sound of the number. Graham watched the dog, then looked back at Juno. And someone didn't like that. Juno let out a small laugh that held no joy. Someone loved it. At first, They told me I was thorough, that I had a good eye. Her voice thinned. Then they started asking for my raw logs, not the reports, not the summaries, the raw data, the stuff that doesn't lie. She looked at her wrists, eyes narrowing. And when I didn't hand it over fast enough, things got unfriendly. Graham's fingers curled around the edge of the bench, knuckles whitening. He didn't ask who. He didn't ask why. Because the answers had a way of crawling into your life and refusing to leave. Juno's gaze shifted toward Graham's shirt. The old tactical fabric, the faded seams, the way the garment sat on him like history. Then her eyes landed on the watch on his wrist, the battered military face, scratched like it had been dragged across years. "You're military?" she asked carefully. Graham didn't like being labeled. Labels stuck. Labels invited questions. He said only, "But you're retired." Juno's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she'd learned to read men who didn't want to be read. Retired from what? Graham's mouth tightened. Work that made me tired. A tiny flicker of humor crossed Juno's face. It vanished just as quickly. She looked back at Coda. "And him?" "Coda," Graham said. Coda's head turned toward his name, eyes steady, as if acknowledging a formal introduction. "He listens," Juno murmured. "He notices," Graham corrected quietly. She swallowed again, then her gaze dropped to something near her chest. Pinned beneath the soaked collar of her jacket was a clipped ID badge. The logo on it was clean, modern, an angular shield with a wave line through it. A private security firm's branding, the kind companies hired when they wanted muscle without uniforms. Graham recognized the style. Not the exact logo, but the type. He'd seen variations of it on bases, on contractor vehicles, on men who wore civilian clothes but moved like they'd been trained to hurt people efficiently. Juno noticed his stare and pulled the badge free. "They make us wear them on site," she said. "Security compliance, background checks, escort policy." She grimaced. "So everyone feels safe?" Coda gave a low, quiet huff, skeptical. Graham didn't comment. He just filed it away. Then the marina door handle rattled, a soft, testing sound. Coda rose instantly, body aligning between the door and the bench. No barking. No lunging. Just pure, controlled warning. Shoulders squared, tail still, eyes fixed. Graham's pulse spiked. He crossed the small room in 2 steps, one hand going automatically to the drawer where he kept a flare gun and a heavy wrench. Not a weapon, not officially. But Payne didn't care about official. The handle rattled again, then stopped. A pause long enough to let fear breathe, and then footsteps retreated across the dock boards, slow, unhurried, like whoever it was wanted them to know they could come and go. Graham exhaled, but the air didn't feel lighter. Juno's eyes were wide. "They followed me." Graham looked at the door, then at Coda, who didn't relax. Not even an inch. "No," Graham said, voice low. "They found you." Juno shivered beneath the blanket, teeth chattering despite the heater. "I tried to lose them," she whispered. "I cut across the service road. I ditched my phone. I took the skiff because it was the only thing on the water. I thought the lake would hide me." Graham stared at the window, where bright sunlight made the world look too innocent. Then Coda did something strange. He walked away from the door, away from the threat, straight to Juno. He sniffed her hands once, then her jacket, then her hair. His ears flicked, as if catching a sound no one else could hear. Then he pressed his nose to her left wrist, right where the rope burn was worst. and let out a soft whine. Not fear, grief. Graham froze, hand still on the bench. Coda didn't whine. Not ever. Not for squirrels, not for storms, not for nightmares that woke Graham at 3 a.m. with a throat full of panic. Juno's breathing hitched. What? What is he doing? Graham's voice came out quieter than he intended. He's recognizing something. Coda lifted his head and looked straight at Graham, amber eyes steady with a weight that felt ancient. And for a split second, Graham felt something he hated admitting to himself. Not instinct, not logic, something like meaning. Like the dog was saying, "This isn't random. This is connected. This is the kind of pain that leaves fingerprints." The moment passed, but the room didn't return to normal. Because now Graham wasn't just sheltering a stranger. He was sheltering a story Coda seemed to already understand. Graham cleared his throat, forcing himself back into motion. "I'm calling someone." Juno's shoulders tensed. "Police?" Graham shook his head. "Not yet." Why not? Because Graham had learned the hard way that sometimes official meant compromised, and sometimes help arrived wearing the wrong face. Instead, he grabbed his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in months. Maybelle Rowan picked up on the second ring. Her voice came through like warm iron, steady, practical. "If this is you calling to flirt, you picked a terrible hour, Graham." Despite everything, a small sound escaped Graham, almost a laugh. Humor, thin as ice, but present. "Maybelle," he said, "I need a favor." Maybelle Rowan was in her 60s, short and sturdy, gray hair cut close like she didn't have patience for vanity. Her hands were always busy. Coffee pots, bandages, comforting gestures. She used to be a military medic before she ran the dockside diner. People said she had the kind of eyes that could spot a lie from across a room and the kind of heart that still fed you anyway. "What kind of favor?" she asked, all business now. "I've got a woman here," Graham said. "Hypothermia, wrist injuries. She's scared." A pause. Graham could almost hear Maybelle's brain clicking into triage mode. "I'm coming," she said. "And don't argue. I'll bring hot soup and supplies. You got Coda?" Graham glanced at the dog, still close to Juno now, like a guard assigned by the gods. "Yeah," Graham said. "I've got him." "Good," Maybelle replied. "Then you've got more sense than half the men in this town." She hung up. Juno stared at Graham. "Who was that?" "Someone who knows how to stop people from dying," Graham said. Juno swallowed. "And the other half of what I need?" Graham's gaze went to the marina, the lake, the bright day, pretending it wasn't full of shadows. "We'll figure it out," he said, though his chest felt tight with the old familiar weight of responsibility. Juno's eyes filled with something like anger wrapped around fear. "I don't want to be dramatic," she said, voice shaking, "but I think they're going to kill me." Graham didn't deny it. Denial was a luxury he didn't own anymore. Instead, he stepped closer, lowering his voice like a vow. "Not in my dock office." Coda's tail thumped once, low and solid, as if the dog approved the promise. When Maybelle arrived 20 minutes later, she came like a storm in boots, carrying a medical bag in one hand and a thermos in the other. She took one look at Juno's blue lips and scraped wrists and muttered a curse that sounded almost affectionate, as if she was scolding the universe. "You poor thing," Maybelle said, kneeling beside Juno. "You're going to live, even if you're inconvenient about it." Juno tried to smile. It came out wobbly. Maybelle's gaze cut to Graham. "What did you drag in this time, sailor?" Graham's jaw worked. She dragged herself in. Maybelle hummed, not entirely convinced. As Maybelle checked Juno's temperature and wrapped her wrists with practiced hands, Coda returned to the door and sat again, watching, listening, guarding the threshold like a mythic beast assigned to a gate no one else could see. Outside, the marina remained bright. Inside, the air tasted like trouble. And Graham knew one thing with uncomfortable clarity. Whatever had been hidden near Buoy 9 had found its way to him anyway. Through water, through fear, through a woman who hadn't drifted by accident. And this time, he couldn't pretend it was just the wind. He looked at Coda, then at Juno, then at Maybelle, who was already planning the next steps with the calm cruelty of someone who'd seen too much and still chose to help. Graham Sloane had tried to live quietly, but the lake, the dog, and the battered gods of consequence had other plans. Morning in town had the bright, harmless look of a postcard. Sunlight warmed the clapboard storefronts, melting yesterday's frost into thin silver streams that ran along the curb. A flag snapped lazily above the diner. Someone's old Labrador watched traffic like it was the sheriff. People waved, unhurried, as if the world had never invented secrets. Graham Sloane walked into that light like a man borrowing it. He kept his shoulders relaxed on purpose, even though every muscle in him wanted to tighten. His faded olive-gray tactical shirt and worn combat pants looked out of place among the locals' flannel and denim, like he'd stepped out of a different story and forgot to change costumes. Clean-shaven, square-jawed, eyes gray-blue and scanning, he moved with quiet economy. Juno Hale walked beside him, bundled in borrowed layers from Maybelle Rowan, a thick wool sweater that swallowed her frame, a down jacket that smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon, and a knitted beanie pulled low over her dark blonde hair. Her face had regained some color since yesterday, but there was still a rawness to her, like her skin was too thin for the world right now. The rope burns on her wrists were wrapped neatly under Maybelle's careful bandages. Coda patted at Graham's left knee, black and tan coat gleaming in the sun. He moved like a sentinel with manners, calm, controlled, eyes always working. They were heading to the marina office in town, the one with a meeting room and a glass wall that showed off the lake like a trophy. Maybelle had insisted they make the visit in daylight, with people around. Predators hate witnesses, she'd said, voice sharp with old experience. And this town has plenty of eyes, even if most of them are looking at pie. Graham hadn't argued. He didn't like crowds, but he liked being hunted even less. Inside the office, the air smelled of fresh paper and lemon cleaner. Framed photos lined the walls. New docs, ribbon, cuttings, smiling groups holding plaques, the town's prosperity pinned up like proof that goodness existed. A receptionist smiled at them, too bright, too practiced. "You're here for Mr. Vance?" Graham's jaw tightened at the name. Elliot Vance. Juno's shoulders rose slightly, then settled. "Yes," she said. "He asked to see us." The receptionist's eyes flicked to Coda, uncertainty flashing. "Dogs aren't usually allowed." "He's with me," Graham said, voice low and firm. The receptionist blinked, as if trying to place him. Something about Graham's posture made people choose compliance without realizing they'd chosen it. "All right," she said quickly. "Just this way." They were led into a conference room where sunlight spilled across polished wood. A carafe of coffee sat steaming beside a plate of pastries like a peace offering. Behind the glass wall, the lake glittered. And then Elliot Vance entered. He looked exactly like the kind of man towns loved. Mid-60s, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the ease of someone who never had to hurry. His hair was silver and neatly combed back. His face was handsome in a weathered way. High forehead, soft crow's feet, a smile that arrived quickly and lingered just long enough to feel personal. He wore a navy blazer over a light blue shirt, no tie, the uniform of "I am important but approachable." He extended a hand to Graham first. "Mr. Sloan, I'm glad you came." His grip was firm, warm, the grip of a man who had shaken hands at fundraisers and funerals and knew exactly how long to hold on. Graham returned the handshake without squeezing too hard. "You wanted to talk." Elliot's gaze shifted to Juno. The warmth didn't leave his eyes, but it changed shape, like a lens refocusing. "Juno Hale," he said gently. "You look like you've had a hard day." Juno's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "That's one way to put it." Elliot turned his attention downward, to Coda. Coda didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply stepped forward and positioned himself half a step between Graham and Elliot, head level, ears forward. Calm, a polite wall. Elliot paused, eyes narrowing slightly, not in fear, but in assessment. "Beautiful dog," he said. "Working line?" Graham's voice stayed neutral. "Yes." Elliot's smile deepened. "Intelligent, then. They always are." Coda stared at him without blinking. Something in Graham's chest tightened, small but unmistakable. He'd lived with Coda long enough to know the dog's neutral from his no. This wasn't aggression. It was certainty. Elliot sat, folding his hands on the table. "Please," he said, gesturing to the chairs. "Coffee?" "I had them bring pastries. I find we all speak more kindly when we're fed." Maybelle would have called that line charming. Graham heard it as strategy. Juno sat slowly, careful with her bandaged wrists. Graham took the seat beside her, angled slightly so he could see the door and the glass reflection behind Elliot. Coda remained standing, close enough that Graham could feel the dog's warmth at his knee. Elliot's eyes moved over them with practiced empathy. "First, I want to say this. Whatever happened, I'm sorry. This town takes care of its own." Juno's gaze dropped to the coffee. "We're not sure the town even knows what's happening." Elliot leaned back, expression thoughtful. "Sometimes people don't see danger until it wears a mask. I've spent a lifetime trying to keep this place safe." He spoke like a man reading from a well-loved script. Graham watched him carefully. "You fund the dredging project." Elliot nodded. "Among other things. Infrastructure is a thankless religion. You build the things people don't think about until they fail." He turned to Juno. "I'm told you found an anomaly in the sonar logs." Juno's throat worked. "Yes." "And you reported it?" "I flagged it," she said. "Then I was asked for raw data. That's not standard. We file processed reports, not the full raw stream." Elliot's expression held steady. "Not standard, but not unheard of. Contractors sometimes want the full record for internal QA." Juno's eyes flashed. "QA doesn't leave rope burns." Silence fell like a lid. Elliot's smile softened, then faded into something more solemn. "Of course not," he sighed. "If someone harmed you, that's criminal. I want you to know I will support an investigation." Graham noticed something then. The way Elliot's gaze flickered briefly toward the glass wall. Not fear, not guilt, calculation. The room felt bright, but Graham's mind shaded it darker. The door opened and another person stepped in, unannounced, like she belonged. A woman in her late 40s, tall and lean, wearing a dark wool coat over a red blouse, her Hair was chestnut brown with silver threading through it, cut in a sharp bob that framed a face built for skepticism. Strong cheekbones, thin lips, eyes that looked like they measured everything and trusted nothing. A notebook was tucked under her arm like a weapon. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, tone polite but unapologetic. "Elliot, you said you wanted transparency. I figured I'd show up while the truth still had time to put its shoes on." Elliot's smile returned, smaller. Ruth Calder, of course. Ruth Calder was the local journalist, the kind small towns pretended to dislike but secretly needed. She had the posture of someone who'd learned to stand firm in rooms full of powerful men. Her gaze moved to Graham, then Juno, then Coda. "You're the technician," Ruth said to Juno. "And you're the doc guy with the military dog." Graham's eyes narrowed. "That's one way to introduce people." Ruth's mouth tilted. "It's the accurate way." Elliot gestured toward an empty chair. "Ruth, please, sit. We were just discussing how to ensure everyone feels safe." Ruth sat, crossing one long leg over the other. "Funny. That's what people say right before they try to bury something." Elliot chuckled softly, like he appreciated her spirit. "You always did have a talent for suspicion." "I learned it here," Ruth replied, eyes sharp. "This town smiles so sweetly it could rot your teeth." Juno swallowed. "I didn't ask for media." Ruth's expression softened slightly. "You didn't ask for rope burns either?" Elliot's hands folded tighter. "Ruth, if you're here to stir panic—" "I'm here because I saw your invoices," Ruth interrupted, voice calm. "And because Juno's data, if it exists, might explain why the dredging budget has strange shadows." Graham's attention sharpened. "Invoices." Ruth nodded once. "Payments routed through shell subcontractors. Equipment, charges that don't match the equipment on site. Nothing illegal on its own. Just misaligned." Misaligned. Graham knew that word. It was the polite word for wrong. Elliot's smile stayed in place, but something in his eyes cooled. "Accounting in large projects is often complex." Ruth smiled back, but hers was all teeth. "Complex and convenient are cousins." Juno's breath caught. She stared at the table, then looked up as if deciding something painful. "I need to say something," she whispered. Graham turned toward her, surprised. Juno's hazel eyes shone with shame and stubbornness in equal measure. "I wasn't just hired by the dredging company last month. I worked for them before, for almost a year." Ruth's pen stopped mid-air. Elliot's expression didn't change, but the air did. Juno continued, voice shaking. "I helped clean data, not falsify. At least, I told myself it wasn't falsifying. They said it was smoothing errors, removing noise, normal processing." Graham's jaw tightened. "And then?" "And then I saw patterns I couldn't explain as noise," Juno said. "Signal gaps that appeared only near one area, buoy 9. Her throat worked. "I asked questions. That's when they started watching me." Ruth leaned forward, eyes bright with grim fascination. "So you're not an innocent bystander?" Juno flinched. "No," she said. "I'm not." Elliot's voice softened like velvet. "Juno, people make mistakes, especially under pressure." The line sounded merciful. It also sounded like a man trying to place her inside a story he could control. Graham watched Coda. The dog hadn't moved, but his body remained subtly angled between Graham and Elliot, like a compass needle refusing to point anywhere else. Elliot stood and walked to the glass wall, looking out over the glittering lake as if it were his to admire. His reflection floated faintly in the glass, an older man haloed by, sunlight, a benefactor, a pillar. He spoke without turning around. "You know," Elliot said, voice warm, almost conversational, "I've always believed the lake chooses who it keeps." Graham's stomach tightened. Elliot finally turned and looked directly at Graham. His smile returned, gentle as a hand on the shoulder. "Mr. Sloan," he said, "have you ever wondered why you chose to live here?" The words were harmless on paper, but in the room they felt like a fingertip pressed to a bruise. Graham didn't answer. He couldn't. Because the truth was, he hadn't chosen the town for beauty or peace. He'd chosen it because it was far, cold, and quiet enough to hide in. And somehow this respected man, this smiling benefactor, had aimed the question straight into that hidden place. Coda's tail went still. Ruth's pen hovered, sensing a shift. Juno's eyes widened like she felt it too. Elliot's smile didn't threaten, it invited. And that invitation felt more dangerous than a threat. Ruth cleared her throat, breaking the spell. "Elliot, that's a strange thing to ask." Elliot chuckled softly. "Is it? Towns are like families. We notice who comes and who stays, especially the quiet ones." Graham forced his voice steady. "People live places for all kinds of reasons." "Of course," Elliot said easily, "and I respect privacy. But I also respect patterns." Ruth's gaze hardened. "You're drifting into intimidation." Elliot lifted his hands in mock surrender. "No intimidation, only curiosity." Graham stood slowly, his chair scraped the floor. "Then be curious from a distance." Elliot's eyes flicked to Coda. "No need to be hostile." Graham's mouth tightened. "I'm not hostile, I'm cautious." Ruth rose too, snapping her notebook shut. "Juno," she said, "if you have raw data, don't hand it to anyone you don't trust. Not the company, not the town council, not Elliot's internal QA." Elliot's smile thinned. "Ruth, you're being dramatic." Ruth looked him dead in the eye. "I'm being alive." Juno stood, swaying slightly. Graham steadied her with a light touch at her elbow, careful, not possessive. Elliot stepped forward as if to escort them out, polite to the last. "I hope you'll reconsider," he said to Graham. "The town benefits when we work together." Graham's gray-blue eyes met his. "The town benefits when the truth isn't rented out." Elliot's expression flickered, so fast it was almost imaginary. Then it smoothed again. "Be well," he said warmly. Graham didn't respond. He guided Juno toward the door. Coda walked between them and Elliot, never once turning his back fully until they crossed the threshold into the hallway. Outside, the sunlight still looked innocent. But now Graham felt it differently. A bright stage, a beautiful mask, and somewhere behind it, something was watching, patiently deciding whether the prey was worth the hunt. As they stepped out into the street, Ruth fell into pace beside them. "I'm not your friend," Ruth said briskly, "but I am allergic to liars." Graham's lips twitched, almost a smile. "That's the closest thing to friendship I've heard in a while." Ruth glanced at Coda. "Your dog doesn't like Elliot." Coda's ears flicked, as if hearing his name in a sentence he approved. Graham's voice dropped. "My dog doesn't waste instincts." Juno hugged her borrowed coat tighter, eyes on the bright town ahead. So what now? Graham looked down at Coda, then up at the street, the lake beyond, the smiling faces that didn't know what was moving underneath their feet. He didn't answer out loud, but inside, the old part of him, trained to survive, had already begun to choose a direction. The town kept smiling after the meeting. People still carried groceries. Dogs still pulled on leashes. The lake still glittered like a god pretending innocence. But Graham Sloan felt the shift the way an old soldier feels a storm. Not in the sky, but in the air, between breaths. Back at the cabin, the light coming through the windows looked too clean, almost theatrical. Juno sat at the small table with Maybelle's mug between her hands, staring into coffee as if it might confess something. Coda lay near the stove, head on his paws, eyes half-lidded. Half-lidded didn't mean asleep. It meant listening. Graham moved through his kitchen like he was counting exits. He checked the door latch twice without meaning to, then stopped himself, annoyed at his own reflexes. He'd promised himself he was done with living like the world was hunting him. And yet, Juno spoke softly. He knew who you were. Graham didn't look at her. He poured water into the kettle as if he could boil the thought away. Everybody knows everybody in a town this size. That wasn't town knowing, Juno said, voice thin. That was precise. Graham's jaw tightened. He set the kettle down. What do you remember from the company? Names, contractors, anything. Juno's fingers tightened around the mug. I remember being told not to ask. I remember a man with a key card who never wore a company logo. Not a foreman, not a diver. Just someone who moved like he belonged anywhere. She looked up, hazel eyes glassy with shame. I don't remember his name. Graham exhaled, slow. Then we find someone who does. He reached for his phone. A number he'd kept saved for years, like a relic he couldn't throw away, but didn't dare touch. The kind of contact that came with ghosts. He pressed call before he could talk himself out of it. It rang twice. A voice answered, male, steady, with the controlled calm of someone who'd spent too long in rooms where panic got people killed. Sloan, the voice said, not a question, a recognition. Graham swallowed. Hayes. Hayes Marlowe sounded older than Graham remembered, but not softer. A federal agent now, at least that's what the last rumor had said. The kind of man who traded camouflage for a suit and still carried the battlefield in his posture. Didn't think you'd call, Hayes said. Yeah, Graham replied, rough. Well, didn't think I'd need to. A beat. Then Hayes's voice shifted, still controlled, but warmer at the edges. Is it bad? Graham's gaze flicked to Juno, to her bandaged wrists, to Coda's watchful stillness. It's complicated. Complicated is my favorite flavor, Hayes said, a dry hint of humor. Then, more serious. Where are you? Graham gave the location. Hayes didn't hesitate. Stay put. I'm 2 hours out. Don't go anywhere public. Don't call local police. And Sloan, if you've stepped into something, don't try to solve it with stubbornness. Graham almost laughed. Stubbornness is all I've got. No, Hayes said. You've got a dog who hates liars. That's an upgrade. Graham looked down. Coda's ears twitched at the sound of Hayes's voice through the speaker, as if he recognized the name the way he recognized thunder. Familiar, not friendly, but worth noticing. 2 hours later, a dark SUV rolled up the cabin's gravel approach. It didn't race. It didn't creep. It arrived like a fact. Hayes Marlowe stepped out. He was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, tall, broad through the shoulders, built like he'd once carried heavy gear and never fully stopped. He wore a charcoal jacket over a plain shirt, jeans, and boots that were too practical to be fashion. His hair was dark, clipped short. Light stubble shadowed his jaw. Neat, restrained, the kind a man keeps when he doesn't have time to care. His eyes were the striking part, Pale hazel, sharp and awake. Eyes that didn't admire scenery. Eyes that measured it. He walked up and paused when he saw Coda. Coda rose in one smooth motion, tail low but wagging once, controlled, like a soldier giving a salute. Hayes's face cracked into a real smile. "Well, look at you," he murmured, crouching slightly. Coda stepped forward, sniffed Hayes's hand, then leaned in just enough to accept a firm scratch behind the ears. Trust, given in small increments. Hayes stood and looked at Graham. "You look like you've been sleeping with one eye open." Graham's mouth tightened. "I've been sleeping with 0 eyes closed." Hayes stepped inside, the cabin's warmth hitting him. His gaze swept the room. Windows, door, corners, automatic, disciplined. Then he spotted Juno. She stood, uncertain, holding herself like she expected to be blamed. She was still small in Maybelle's clothes, but her eyes carried the stubborn fire of someone who'd decided she'd rather be afraid than silent. Hayes's voice softened a notch. "You're the technician." Juno nodded. "Juno Hale." Hayes tilted his head. "You're shaking." Juno's laugh came out brittle. Not from cold. Hayes didn't push. He just nodded, like he understood the language of fear. Graham didn't offer pleasantries. "I found something. Sonar logs, coordinates, a USB." Hayes's gaze sharpened. "Where?" Graham pulled the bag from a cupboard, placed it on the table and slid it over. Hayes opened it, methodical. He didn't touch things more than necessary. He scanned the notebook, the drive, the printed coordinates, his jaw set. "That's not just weird data," Hayes said quietly. Juno swallowed. "What is it?" Hayes looked up at Graham first, as if deciding how much truth to drop and how fast. Then he said it. "Money laundering," Hayes told them. "And not small-town skim. I'm talking multi-layered, routing, shell companies, contractors hiding behind contractors." Graham felt his stomach go cold. "Using the lake," Hayes nodded. "Using the lake, and something in it." Juno's fingers clenched. "Something in the lake?" Hayes tapped the coordinates. "There are containers down there, not lost cargo, deliberate sinks. Some hold materials that never show up in manifests. Some hold cash. Some hold evidence." He leaned back and exhaled. "When people use water like a vault, it's because they trust the lake to keep secrets better than a bank." Coda's ears pricked at the tension in their voices. He moved closer to Graham's leg, pressing his shoulder lightly against him, grounding. Graham's voice went low. "How do you know this?" Hayes's expression tightened. "Because I've been chasing fragments of it for months. This isn't just a local scam, it's a network. And Elliot Vance..." He stopped, careful. Graham's eyes narrowed. "Say it." Hayes's gaze held steady. "I can't call him guilty without proof that holds up in court. But he's connected. He's too clean, too central, too loved." Juno's voice cracked. "He's kind." Hayes's mouth twitched humorlessly. "So is a hook until it's in your mouth." Silence stretched. Then Juno spoke again, softer. "There's something else I haven't said." Graham's spine went rigid. Hayes watched her closely, calm but ready. Juno's throat worked. "I did more than smooth data." She looked like she wanted to run, but she stayed. "I altered the output once," she admitted. "Not because I wanted to. Because they told me it was national security. They said I'd be protected if I cooperated." Hayes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who told you?" Juno shook her head. "I don't know his name, but he had a badge. Not company, not police. Something federal-looking." Graham's hands tightened into fists. Juno's voice broke. I quit when I realized people could die. When I realized the anomaly wasn't an anomaly. It was hiding. Hayes nodded once. Good. You walked away. Juno's eyes filled. Too late. Hayes's voice softened again, surprising in a man built of steel. Not too late. If you're breathing and telling the truth, it's not too late. Graham stared at the table, jaw clenched. In his head, the old gods of guilt began their chant. You should have known. You should have stopped it. You always arrive after the damage. Coda nudged Graham's hand once, firm. Not comfort. Command. Be here. Night fell gently, almost politely, like the town wanted to apologize for its own darkness. Hayes stayed. He didn't trust the road. He didn't trust the timing. He said he'd make calls in the morning. They ate a quiet meal, Maybelle's soup reheated, bread toasted. Coda watched Hayes with a steady acceptance, as if recognizing another warrior who'd learned to sit with silence. Then, near midnight, Coda rose. Not suddenly, not alarmed, just certain. He walked to the back door and stood there, nose close to the seam where wood met cold air. Graham's heartbeat slowed, then sharpened. Hayes glanced up from his phone. What's he doing? Coda didn't bark. He didn't scratch. He stared, and then very softly he exhaled, a low breath that fogged the glass. Graham stood, crossing the room soundlessly. He opened the back door. Cold air slid in like a blade. The yard looked empty. Snow glittered faintly. Pines stood like dark gods, unmoving, but Coda stepped outside and stopped at the edge of the porch. Head tilted, listening to something Graham couldn't hear. Hayes moved behind Graham, weapon already in hand. Not pointed, but ready. Then Graham saw it. A footprint. Fresh. Just beyond the porch. Not deep enough to be from earlier. Not placed by accident. A single print, like a punctuation mark, and beside it, half buried in snow, was a tiny strip of fabric. Dark. Synthetic. Like the edge of a glove. Coda looked back at Graham once. Not fear, not panic. A message. They're close, and they're careful. Graham's mouth went dry, because whoever had been there hadn't attacked, hadn't forced entry. They'd come close enough to leave a sign, and leave again. Like a predator tasting the air, deciding how best to take the throat. Hayes pulled Graham back inside and shut the door. His voice stayed low. Someone's probing. Graham nodded, throat tight. They don't know how much we know. Or they're measuring how fast you'll move, Hayes said. He glanced at Juno. Do you have anywhere else safe? Juno shook her head, pale. No. Hayes's jaw tightened. Then we make this place expensive to touch. He moved through the cabin, checking windows, scanning sight lines, quietly repositioning furniture like a man, rearranging a battlefield. Graham watched, feeling something old awaken in his bones, an instinct he'd tried to bury under normal life. He hated how familiar it felt. He also hated how good it felt to have purpose again. Juno sat rigid at the table, hands wrapped around her mug like it was the only solid thing left in the world. I didn't mean to bring this to you, she whispered. Graham's voice came out softer than he expected. You didn't bring it. It came. Like weather. Hayes glanced at Graham, then at Coda. Your dog chose you for a reason. Graham swallowed. Don't do that mystical stuff. Hayes's mouth twitched. Not mystical, tactical. Dogs notice what humans ignore. Coda lay down again, but this time he faced the door, eyes open, unblinking. Graham stared at the USB on the table. A small object, a heavy fate. He wanted to throw it into the stove and pretend none of it existed. He wanted that more than he wanted anything. But the footprint in the snow had already answered the question. This wasn't going away. Not politely. Not safely. And in the bright north, under stars that looked like ancient watching eyes, Graham realized the truth had teeth. It didn't arrive once. It circled. It returned. And it waited for the moment you looked away. Morning in the north arrived like a polite god. Bright, cold, pretending not to notice what humans did in the dark. Lake Superior lay beyond Graham Sloane's cabin, blue as a blade and calm as a lie. The water flashed with sun, and the gulls sounded almost cheerful, as if they hadn't gotten the memo that trouble had finally decided to stop circling and start biting. Graham stood on the porch in his worn olive-gray tactical combat shirt, cuffs frayed from weather and too many washes. His old combat pants hung right, loose enough to move, softened at the knees. His work boots were scuffed the way a man's soul gets scuffed when it keeps walking anyway. Clean-shaven, no beard to hide behind, his square jaw and sharp cheekbones looked carved by cold wind. Dark brown hair sat in a tight military cut, just a touch longer than the strictest standard. Like a quiet rebellion he allowed himself. His eyes, gray-green, watched the tree line like it could confess. Coda sat at his heel. A full-grown German shepherd, 4 or 5 years old, black and tan coat gleaming in the morning light. He didn't fidget. He didn't beg. He observed with the calm authority of a creature who understood that humans often needed saving from their own ideas. His amber-brown eyes had that steady, soldierly patience that made Graham feel both protected and judged. Inside, Juno paced. She wore borrowed layers now, Maybelle's flannel hanging slightly large on her frame, yet her posture still carried the tightness of someone who expected footsteps behind her at any moment. Her wrists, scraped and bruised, had begun to heal, but her mind hadn't. Hayes Marlowe sat at the table with a phone in one hand and a pen in the other, making notes that looked like short prayers. Tall, broad-shouldered, in practical boots and a charcoal jacket, he had the contained energy of a man who never fully left the field. Light stubble shadowed his jaw, and his pale hazel eyes kept flicking to windows, door frames, angles, like danger might be hiding behind geometry. "You hear from Ruth?" Hayes asked. Juno stopped pacing. "She'll publish today." Graham's throat tightened. "She shouldn't." "She already did the work," Juno said. "If she doesn't publish, they win without lifting a finger." Hayes exhaled through his nose. "Publishing changes the board." "It's just an article," Graham muttered. Hayes's mouth twitched. "That's what people say right before an empire falls?" They waited. The kind of waiting that doesn't feel like time passing, more like time holding its breath. Then the notification came. Ruth Calder's first investigative piece went live. Ruth didn't just write like a reporter. She wrote like someone who'd learned to turn fear into a flashlight. She was in her mid-30s, lean and sharp-eyed, hair the color of dark honey pulled into a messy knot that always looked accidental but never was. Freckles dusted her pale skin like spilled cinnamon. Her voice on the phone, when she called Hayes immediately after publishing, was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it. Not panic. Anger. "People are going to pretend this is about paperwork," Ruth said. "It's not. It's about bodies that never got counted and money that never should have existed." Hayes kept his voice low. "Did you name anyone?" "I named patterns," Ruth replied. "I named numbers. I named the way the lake keeps swallowing what it's fed." Her laugh was small and humorless. "Which means they'll try to feed it me next." Graham listened from the doorway, jaw tight. Coda's ears flicked toward the phone as if he could hear the shape of Ruth's courage. "Get somewhere public," Hayes told her. Ruth snorted. "Public doesn't scare predators. It just gives them an audience." Then she hung up, and the air in the cabin changed. Not colder, sharper. Even the sunlight felt like it had edges. Graham checked the USB again, like a man touching a talisman to prove it hadn't turned into dust overnight. The drive was small, ordinary, the kind of thing you could lose in a couch cushion. And yet men would burn for it. Juno stood close, watching his hands. If Ruth's right, if the lake is being used like a vault— Hayes nodded. "Then what's on that drive is a map to the vault." Graham's old watch ticked in the silence. A steady pulse. A reminder that time didn't care who deserved more of it. Coda rose suddenly. Not barking, not growling, just rising with purpose and stepping toward the back of the cabin, head lifting as if the air itself had spoken. Graham felt it too. A faint scent, a shift in pressure, the way the world changes when an unseen decision has been made. "Out," Hayes said immediately. Graham's eyes snapped to him. "You sure?" Hayes's gaze didn't blink. "I've been sure in rooms where being wrong meant a body bag." Graham didn't argue. He grabbed the USB, the sonar notebook, and the small bag they'd been keeping together. Juno snatched her shoes. Hayes moved like a man who'd practiced emergency exits the way other people practiced smiling. Coda went first, pushing through the door like he owned the outside. And then the cabin erupted. Not in a Hollywood explosion. In the ugly, real way fire chooses its victims. A sudden bloom of smoke, a crackle from within the walls, a rushing heat that felt too fast to be accidental. They didn't hear a gunshot. They didn't see a person. They only saw what the fire meant. Not murder. Erasure. "They're not trying to kill us," Hayes said, voice hard. "They're trying to delete us." Juno coughed, eyes stinging. "Ruth!" Hayes's jaw clenched. "This is their answer to Ruth." Graham's lungs filled with cold air and rage. He watched flame lick the cabin windows like hungry tongues, swallowing the place he'd tried to turn into a quiet life. Coda stood between Graham and the burning cabin, body angled, tail stiff, eyes fixed on the tree line, guarding the people, not the property. Graham's chest tightened at that. Even the dog knew what mattered. "Move!" Hayes snapped. And then Graham realized the cruel comedy of it. He'd spent months trying to live like a man with no enemies, and now fire had shown up to remind him that peace was not something you earned. It was something you defended. They ran. Not blindly, not in panic, because Hayes wouldn't allow it, and Coda wouldn't tolerate it. They moved downhill toward the marina, through brush and uneven ground, the air behind them turning orange as smoke climbed into the sky. A figure appeared near the dock, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy jacket and a knit cap pulled low, moving with the easy balance of someone who'd grown up reading water the way others read books. Caleb Ward. He was in his early 30s, sun-browned from wind and glare, with a strong nose and a calm face that looked carved from patience. He had the kind of eyes that didn't widen easily. Steel gray, steady. A lake rescue guy, the sort who knew how quickly water could turn from friend to grave. "What the hell?" Caleb started, then saw the smoke and stopped asking questions. Because the North teaches people a simple rule. When you see fire, you move first and talk later. "This way," Caleb said, voice flat with urgency. "Boathouse, now." They followed him across the dock and into a weathered boat storage shed, wooden walls smelling of rope, fuel, wet pine. Caleb yanked the door shut and slid a heavy bolt into place. He didn't ask who. He didn't ask why. He just looked at Graham and said, "You brought trouble." Graham coughed, eyes watering. Trouble brought itself. Caleb's gaze flicked to Hayes, federal posture, controlled calm, then to Juno, shaking but standing, then to Coda, who stood at Graham's side like a living shield. Caleb's mouth twitched. "At least you brought a dog with manners." Coda stared at him as if to say, "Manners are optional, loyalty isn't." Minutes passed, or hours. Time in hiding gets weird, like it's embarrassed to be measured. The smoke outside thinned, but the fear inside did not. Then Coda moved again. He walked to the small crack beneath the boathouse door, lowered his head, and released a low, tense sound. Not a bark, not a growl. A warning. Graham's body went cold. Hayes leaned in, listening. And then they heard it, faint at first. Water sloshing, not waves. Footsteps, careful and deliberate, on the dock. Someone was out there, not rushing, not searching wildly. Hunting like they had time. Graham's fingers tightened around the bag containing the USB, knuckles whitening. Juno held her breath so hard she looked like she might shatter. Caleb reached for a boat hook as if it were a spear from an old myth, ridiculous and perfect at the same time. Hayes whispered, "No sound." Coda's ears pinned back, his gaze locked on the crack beneath the door. And then, something small slid under the gap, a laminated card. It skated across the floor and stopped near Graham's boot. Graham stared at it, heart hammering. He didn't pick it up at first, as if it might be cursed. Hayes did carefully, using 2 fingers like it was evidence and poison at once. The card was an access badge. No name, no photo, only a symbol, clean, minimal, corporate, printed over a strip of code. A symbol Graham recognized with the uneasy certainty of memory. Not local police, not the dredging company. Something that existed in the gray space between government and profit. Hayes's eyes narrowed. "They're telling us something," Juno whispered, voice trembling. "What?" Hayes held up the badge. "They know we're alive, and they want us to know they can still reach us." Coda's tail didn't move. He simply stood there, between humans and door, as if daring the outside world to try. The dock creaked again. Then silence. The footsteps retreated. Not because they couldn't break in, because they didn't need to. Not yet. And that was worse, because it meant this wasn't a panic response. It was strategy. It was patience. It was the kind of evil that smiles while it sharpens the knife. Eventually, Caleb exhaled and whispered, "Who in God's name are you people?" Graham's laugh came out dry. "The kind who make arson look like punctuation." Hayes looked at Graham, then at the bag. "We can't stay here." "Where do we go?" Juno asked. "Maybelle," Caleb said without hesitation. "She'll help?" Hayes asked, surprised. Caleb's expression hardened. Maybelle Rowan was a combat medic before she ran a dockside diner. She's the kind of woman who treats a wound first and lectures. You later, and she hates bullies. Maybelle's place was warm and bright, lit like a hearth against the cold world. She was in her late 50s, sturdy, silver hair cut short, cheeks weathered by wind and laughter, eyes sharp as needles. She took one look at Juno's scraped skin and Graham's smoke-stung face and said, "Sit." Then she looked at Hayes. "And you, stop standing like a statue. You're blocking my light." Hayes blinked, then almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." Maybelle cleaned burns and soot and small cuts with hands that knew what panic looked like and refused to feed it. She moved with brisk competence, the kind that made people feel safe even when nothing was. Coda stayed close, leaning into Graham whenever Graham's breathing hit that tight edge that came before nightmares. Maybelle watched the dog and said half to herself, "That one's got a guardian soul." Graham swallowed. "Yeah." Caleb stood by the window, watching the street. "The whole town's going to see that smoke." "Let them," Maybelle said. "People act brave when they're angry together." Hayes finally unfolded the newest piece on the table. "Ruth's article did its job," he said. "Now we connect the rest." Graham's voice was low. "Elliot Vance?" Hayes shook his head. "He's not the center." Juno stiffened. "He's not?" Hayes tapped his notes. "He's a gateway, a financial door. Money moves through him because he's respected, because no one questions the man who pays for the hospital wing and waves at kids during parades." Caleb muttered, "So he's a saint with a bank account." Hayes's mouth twitched. "Exactly." "And the containers?" Graham asked. Hayes's gaze held Graham's. "They're not just cash. They're proof. Something under the lake ties the contractors, the shell companies, the routes, everything." Graham felt the old SEAL part of his mind start assembling, the picture like a weapon. Not dramatic, not heroic, just inevitable. Juno's voice came out small. "So we need what's under the water." Hayes nodded. "We need one container, one chain, one undeniable thread." Maybelle set down a clean bandage, eyes narrowing. "And what happens to people who pull threads around here?" Graham looked down at Coda. The dog met his gaze with quiet certainty, as if the answer had already been chosen. Graham's chest ached. Not from fear, not exactly. From the strange, painful truth that purpose feels like weight at first, then like breath. "We don't pull it alone," Graham said. Caleb glanced at him. "Who's we?" Graham looked at Maybelle, at Caleb, at Hayes, at Juno, this messy little circle of humans refusing to be erased. "We," Graham repeated. "The town. The ones who are tired of being lied to." Outside, sunlight slid across the lake like a blessing that didn't ask permission. And somewhere out, there, the people who lit the fire were realizing their mistake. They'd tried to delete the story. Instead, they'd underlined it. Spring in the north looked like mercy and felt like a dare. The sky over Lake Superior was clean and bright, the kind of blue that made people believe the world had forgiven them, until the wind slipped a cold hand under every collar and reminded them forgiveness was never free. Sunlight glittered on the water like coins scattered by an indifferent god, and the shoreline smelled of wet pine, thawing earth, and old secrets finally loosening their grip. Graham Sloan stood at the dock in his worn olive-gray tactical combat shirt, the fabric softened by time, the cuffs lightly frayed as if the sleeve itself had been through weather and arguments. His old combat pants, earthy green-brown, hung just right, practical and tired. Scuffed work boots planted him solidly on the planks. A scratched military watch clung to his wrist like a small, stubborn memory. He was clean-shaven, no beard to hide behind. A square jaw, pronounced cheekbones, and wind-browned skin that still ran bright beneath the northern chill. Dark brown hair cut in a tight military style, slightly longer than the strictest SEAL line, like a quiet "I'm still here" to a world that had tried to erase him. His eyes, gray-green, stayed on the water with the steady focus of a man who'd learned that danger didn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wore calm. Coda sat beside him, a full-grown German shepherd, black and tan coat catching the sunlight like a polished shield. 4 to 5 years old, muscular without being bulky, alert without being frantic. His ears tracked every sound, and his gaze measured people the way old soldiers measured exits. He was the kind of dog who didn't need to bark to make a point. His presence was the point. Caleb Ward arrived with a coil of rope slung over one shoulder and a thermos in the other hand, moving with the relaxed balance of someone who understood water the way most people understood sidewalks. He looked like the lake had raised him. Steel gray, eyes, weathered cheeks, and a calm face that didn't waste expressions. His jacket smelled faintly of fuel and cold air. "You ready to go fishing?" Caleb asked. Graham's mouth twitched. "If the fish are financial records and bad decisions, sure." Caleb huffed a laugh. "Those bite back." A truck door slammed behind them. Hayes Marlowe stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, built like a man who never fully stopped being assigned to something. Light stubble shadowed his jaw. His hazel eyes were tired but sharp, scanning the marina the way a wolf scans a clearing. He moved with contained urgency, like time was a living thing he was wrestling. Behind Hayes came the federal team. No flashing lights, no heroic music. Just professionals in layered jackets and hard faces, the kind who looked like they'd seen enough paperwork to lose faith and enough crime scenes to find it again. Special Agent Nadine Park introduced herself with a firm handshake and a voice that was calm in the way steel is calm. She was in her early 40s, hair cut in a neat dark bob tucked under a knit cap, skin pale against the cold, eyes black-brown and steady. No wasted words, no wasted emotion. But there was something in her posture, an invisible weight, like she'd carried other people's grief often enough to recognize it on sight. "This is a recovery operation," Nadine said. "Not a conversation. If anyone's feeling chatty, save it for therapy." Graham glanced down at Coda. "She sounds fun." Coda's tail moved once, a single patient thump that could have meant humans and their jokes. Keep them. The lake doesn't care. 2 divers climbed out of a second vehicle. The first was Captain Roy Vetter, a stocky man in his 50s with a gray beard trimmed short and eyes the color of river stones. His hands were thick, scarred, practical. He looked like someone who'd fought the weather long enough that he now spoke it as a second language. The second was Silas Boone, tall and broad, younger, with a shaved head and a quiet stare that made his face look carved. He checked gear with ritual precision, like each buckle was a vow. He didn't talk much, but his presence was heavy with competence. Juno arrived last, stepping carefully onto the dock like the wood might judge her. She wore layers borrowed from Maybelle, hair pulled back, cheeks pale in the cold. Her eyes kept flicking toward the water, as if she expected it to accuse her. She'd lived inside sonar data long enough to forget how vast the real lake was. Now that she stood beside it, she looked smaller, not weak, just human. Ruth Calder didn't come in person. She stayed in town, public places, bright lights, witnesses, but she texted Hayes a single message before they launched. "If the lake gives you the truth, don't you dare let them drown it again." The boat pushed off into sunlight that pretended to be warm. Graham sat near the stern with Coda's leash looped, around his wrist more out of habit than necessity. Coda didn't pull. He didn't need to. His body leaned forward as the shoreline faded behind them, eyes fixed on the water with a solemn intensity that made Graham's skin prickle. The coordinates came from what Juno had pieced together. Sonar anomalies, patterns in non-existent shipping lanes, and the kind of human testimony that never shows up in spreadsheets. Caleb guided them with the confidence of a man who could read subtle changes in watercolor and wave texture like punctuation. "Here," Caleb said at last. "This is where the lake goes quiet." "Lakes don't go quiet," Silas murmured. Caleb's gaze stayed on the surface. "This one does, when it's hiding something heavy." Captain Vetter nodded once, as if he understood exactly what kind of heavy Caleb meant. They dropped anchor. Vetter and Silas suited up. The wetsuits looked like black armor, thick and unforgiving. Regulators hissed. Tank valves clicked open. The divers moved with the measured rhythm of men descending into a place where mistakes become memorials. Nadine turned to Graham. "You'll stay on the boat." Graham's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to watch." "You're here to keep your civilian bones intact," Nadine replied. "Let the divers do the drowning." Graham almost smiled at the line despite himself. Humor was an old medicine, bitter but still medicine. Coda didn't like waiting. He paced once, then stopped, head lifting, nostrils flaring as if he could smell something beneath 40 feet of water. His ears angled forward, his eyes narrowed. Graham felt a strange twist in his chest, like the dog was listening to a radio only he could hear. Juno stood near the sonar monitor, hands clasped tightly. Her knuckles were white. "I used to think numbers were clean," she whispered. Graham didn't look at her. "Numbers are honest. People aren't." Juno flinched, not from the words, but from how much truth they carried. Minutes stretched. The water shimmered. The sunlight danced. And beneath them, men sank into dark. Captain Vetter's voice crackled through the radio. "Visibility's low. Thermocline's nasty." Silas's voice followed, calm, controlled. "We've got debris, metal, rope, something anchored." Nadine leaned in, focused. "Confirm target." A pause. Then Silas. "Container. Looks like shipping grade. Heavily corroded, but it's here." Juno closed her eyes like she'd been punched by relief. Graham's stomach tightened. Relief was never just relief. It was always tangled with what came next. They attached lift bags. Air pumped in. The bags swelled like strange black lungs underwater. The surface began to tremble, as if the lake itself resented giving anything back. Coda suddenly froze. Not a casual pause. Not curiosity. A full-body lock, muscles tight, eyes fixed on one spot of water just off the boat's port side. Then he whined, low, urgent, almost wounded. Graham's skin went cold. "Coda?" The dog didn't look at him. He leaned forward, paws on the rail, and let out a single sharp bark, command-like, as if ordering the lake itself to confess. And then something broke the surface. Not the container. A small object bobbed up first, spinning in a slow circle like it couldn't decide if it wanted air or silence. Graham reached out instinctively, grabbed it. It was a set of dog tags. Metal, dulled and scratched, strung on a chain that looked like it had been chewed by time. The letters were still readable. Graham stared, and the world narrowed to the shape of a name. A teammate. A man Graham had lost and buried in his mind with a kind of brutal ceremony. Filed. Finished. Don't open again. His throat tightened. His hands, steady hands that had stitched wounds and held rifles, shook just slightly around the cold metal. Caleb noticed first. "You know, that name." Graham didn't answer, because if he spoke, the sound might crack him in half. Juno's eyes widened. "Why would—" Hayes stepped closer, face tightening. "That tag shouldn't be here." Nadine's gaze sharpened. "Explain." Graham swallowed hard. "Mason was on an operation years ago. Different life, different lake, Caleb muttered. Same kind of people, Hayes said quietly, like he already understood what the tag implied. Graham stared at the metal. It felt like the lake had reached up and grabbed him by the heart. Not destiny, not magic. Something worse and more real. Evidence that his past had been connected to this machinery of lies long before he ever tried to become a quiet man in a cabin. Coda pressed his shoulder against Graham's leg, grounding him, steadying him, reminding him that the living still needed him. Graham exhaled. He didn't just die, Graham whispered. He got used. The sun shone bright, the lake looked beautiful, and Graham felt something sink in him that no water could touch. The container surfaced next. It rose slow, like an exhausted beast being dragged into daylight against its will. Water cascaded off rusted metal. Chains groaned. The boat rocked gently, as if bowing to the weight of truth. Captain Vetter and Silas surfaced and clung to the side, breathing hard, eyes narrowed against the cold. "Got it," Vetter rasped. Lake didn't want to let go. "Lakes don't have morals," Silas said. "People do." They secured the container and towed it toward shore with careful precision. No cheering, no victory speeches, just grim focus. Because everyone on that boat understood, the moment you drag evidence into the light, you invite darkness to fight back. Back at a secured staging area, federal vehicles, tarps, portable lights, the container was opened. Inside were sealed cases, waterproof, labeled in codes and fake manifests. Nadine's team cataloged everything with the kind of methodical calm that makes chaos manageable. Financial records, shipping lists, company names layered like masks. Juno stared at one file and went pale. "I've seen these routing codes." Hayes didn't look surprised. "Because you were made to see them, to normalize them." A folder surfaced with Elliot Vance's name linked to a chain of shell companies. Not the head, the doorway. Graham watched Nadine's face as she skimmed the documents. Her expression didn't change much, but her eyes hardened, like a judge deciding a sentence. "We have enough," Nadine said, "to arrest Elliot Vance today." Caleb let out a low whistle. "The town's golden man." "Gold is just soft metal," Nadine replied. "It dents." Elliot's arrest happened without spectacle. No sirens, no dramatic tackle, just agents at his door as the sun shone on a town that still wanted to believe in its benefactor. Graham didn't go. He stayed near the staging area, staring at Mason Lark's dog tag. It wasn't fate. It was a ledger entry carved in steel. Hayes approached quietly. "You're thinking it's your fault." Graham's eyes stayed on the tag. "It's always someone's fault." Hayes hesitated, then spoke with the measured honesty of a man who knew truth could be a weapon or a bandage depending on how you handed it over. "I didn't betray you," Hayes said. Graham finally looked up. Hayes's jaw tightened. "But I didn't tell you everything. I held back certain details, names, timelines, because if you knew and they got to you, they'd get to the whole case." Graham's gray-green eyes narrowed. "So you lied." Hayes shook his head once. "I protected." "Same word," Graham muttered. "Different taste." Coda stood between them, not aggressively, just present, a silent judge with fur. Hayes exhaled. "You can hate me for it, but the truth is, this ring is bigger than Elliot, bigger than the town. We needed him comfortable enough to keep the door open." Graham stared at the dog tag again. "And Mason?" Hayes's voice softened. "I don't know yet, but if his tag was in that lake, Someone wanted to bury more than money. Graham's throat tightened. Or bury guilt. Hayes met his gaze. You don't get to drown alone. Not anymore. Graham almost laughed. Small, sharp, bitter. That's supposed to comfort me? Hayes's mouth twitched. No, it's supposed to annoy you into staying alive. Caleb chuckled under his breath. Works on me. Juno stepped closer, eyes wet but steady. I'll testify. I'll name what I did. I won't hide behind I didn't know. Graham studied her face. Fear still there, but now braided with resolve. Good, Nadine called from behind them. Because we're going to need every honest voice we can get. The wind carried lake spray and sunlight. The Tetch's evidence sat under tarps like a sleeping monster. And Graham stood with a dog tag in his hand and the weight of a past he could no longer pretend belonged to someone else. The lake had given up its secret. Now Graham had to decide what to do with his. Morning arrived over Lake Superior like a careful god, bright-handed, quiet-footed, pretending not to notice the wreckage humans carried inside their ribs. The town wore spring the way a child wore an oversized coat, proud of it, slightly swallowed by it. Sunlight spilled across the harbor, glittering on water that looked innocent while holding 1,000 cold stories beneath its skin. The pines exhaled resin and thaw. The docks creaked like old knees. Seagulls laughed as if they'd never been audited. Graham Sloan stood near the courthouse steps in his faded olive-gray tactical combat shirt, softened by years of washing and weather, frayed at the cuffs and shoulder seams. Old combat pants in earth and moss tones hung on him the way a life half left behind still hangs on a man. Scuffed work boots, a scratched military watch, no beard, clean-shaven, jaw square and exposed, cheekbones sharp enough to catch the light. Dark brown hair cut short in a soldier's style. Just a touch, longer than regulation, as if his body refused to fully surrender its old rules. His skin was fair but wind-darkened. His eyes, gray-green, watched the courthouse door with the steady patience of someone who'd survived long enough to distrust tidy endings. At his side sat Coda, a black-and-tan German shepherd, 4 to 5 years old, full-grown and powerful without looking bulky, built for work, not show. His amber-brown gaze tracked movement with a discipline that was almost human. He didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He simply existed with the quiet authority of a guardian statue that happened to breathe. Juno waited a few steps away, hands clasped, shoulders tight under a borrowed jacket that was too big for her frame. She looked like someone who lived in sound waves and numbers, soft-spoken, precise, wary. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was pale from sleepless nights. Her eyes held a stubborn spark, the kind that appears when fear finally gets tired of winning. Across the street, Ruth Calder stood with a notebook tucked under her arm, chin lifted, expression calm in the way a match is calm before it kisses a fuse. She wore her curly hair loose today, copper strands catching sunlight. There was ink smudged on one finger. Ruth looked like truth had tried to break her before, failed, and now she walked around with a slightly dangerous gratitude for the opportunity. Caleb Ward leaned against his rescue truck, arms folded, posture casual, gaze not casual at all. He wore the same weathered confidence as always. Steady eyes, quiet humor. The lake's calm reflected in a man who'd hauled strangers out of cold water more times than he could count, without becoming a different kind of ghost. And in the courthouse doorway, Maybelle Rowan appeared, older than she pretended to be, softer than she pretended to feel. A former military medic turned harbor diner owner. She moved with that specific kind of practiced gentleness that comes from seeing too much blood and choosing, anyway, to keep serving coffee. She caught Graham's eye and raised 2 fingers in a small salute that said, "You still breathing? Good. Don't stop." Graham's mouth twitched. "Town's got a welcoming committee." Caleb's grin was faint. "You're famous now. Try not to ruin it by being charming." Graham glanced down at Coda. "Hear that? I'm being advised against charm." Coda's tail thumped once, dry, unimpressed. A dog's version of "proceed with caution, human." Inside, the hearing was less dramatic than a movie would promise, and more frightening than a movie would admit. Men in suits spoke in careful language. Paperwork did what bullets couldn't. It made powerful people sweat in public. Elliot Vance's name was said out loud, not with hatred, but with the sober finality of consequence. Juno's testimony was steady, but it cost her. Each detail seemed to peel something off her skin: shame, fear, denial, until her voice sounded like it was coming from someone newly born and already tired. When she finished, she didn't look triumphant. She looked lighter. Ruth took notes without smiling. Caleb watched the exits, as if expecting trouble to remember where it left its shoes. Graham sat still, hands clasped, heart loud. His body understood combat. Courtrooms were different. In combat, you knew where the enemy stood. In a courtroom, the enemy could be a polite nod, a delayed signature, a man who claimed he was simply following procedure. Coda pressed a shoulder against Graham's shin, warm and firm. A reminder: stay, breathe, don't drift. Afterward, the town tried to exhale. Some people were angry, some were ashamed. Some were relieved in the way a person is relieved after waking up and realizing the nightmare was real but survivable. Outside the courthouse, Special Agent Nadine Park, hair in a neat dark bob, eyes steady as a locked door, spoke with federal calm to a small cluster of officials. She didn't smile. She didn't posture. She looked like a woman who kept her faith in systems the way a mechanic kept faith in engines. Not because they were perfect, but because someone had to keep them running. "We'll be monitoring," Nadine said. "Protective measures will remain in place." Graham approached, careful. "This is done?" Nadine looked at him the way one looks at a man holding a cracked cup and asking if the storm is over. "The case is closing. Accountability is beginning. Those are different animals." Coda's ears twitched. Nadine's gaze dropped to the dog, and for the first time her expression softened by a fraction. "Good dog," she said, like she meant it. Coda did not react. He accepted praise the way old kings accept applause, without needing it. They thought the day's danger had passed. They were wrong, though not in the obvious way. That evening, Maybell's diner became the town's unofficial confession booth. The neon sign buzzed. Coffee steamed. Pie cooled on the counter like a sweet promise that life could still be simple if people worked at it. Caleb sat in a booth, eating quietly. Ruth was in the corner writing, her face lit by a small lamp and the wild satisfaction of a story, finally stepping into daylight. Juno sat with both hands wrapped around a mug, as if warmth could anchor her to the world. Graham stood by the window, watching the harbor. Coda lay at his feet until he didn't. The dog rose suddenly, body stiff, ears forward, head turning toward the kitchen door. Not the main entrance, not the windows, the back door. Coda's hackles didn't rise. His posture wasn't aggression. It was recognition, like a priest sensing a lie at the altar. Graham followed Coda's gaze. A man stood just inside the kitchen's back corridor. He wasn't local. His clothes were plain, but too clean. His stance was too balanced. His eyes didn't look at the menu boards or the pie. They scanned faces, exits, angles. He had a trimmed beard and a jawline that suggested discipline rather than vanity. A faint scar cut through one eyebrow. He smiled at Maybelle. Too polite, too practiced. Maybelle's hands paused mid-wipe of a plate. Coda stepped forward and placed himself between Graham and the corridor, silent as a drawn blade. The man's eyes flicked to Coda. His smile faltered for a heartbeat. Just one. Then he turned as if he'd forgotten something and walked out the way he came, disappearing into the dusk. No threat spoken, no scene made. Yet the air in the diner changed, like someone had opened a freezer door. Ruth looked up from her notebook, eyes narrowing. Who was that? Maybelle swallowed, voice quiet. No one. Caleb's gaze stayed on the corridor. That's not how no one walks. Juno's hands shook around her mug. Are we still in danger? Graham stared at the back door, pulse steady in the way a man's pulse gets when fear becomes familiar. Then Coda looked up at him. Amber brown eyes, calm, not panicked. Not warning of doom, warning of choice. Graham understood it the way sailors understand tide. The danger might fade, but it didn't vanish. It simply moved. And if Graham tried to run again, it would follow, because running always leaves tracks. Graham exhaled slowly. We're not doing this tonight, he said softly, more to himself than anyone. Not tonight. Coda's tail thumped once, approving the boundary. Even guardians needed rest. The diner breathed again. But every person in that room knew one truth. The world had heard them. And the world, like the lake, did not always like what surfaced. The weeks that followed were not a parade. They were paperwork, statements, safety protocols, and the slow, bruising process of a town admitting it had been charmed. Juno entered witness protection under Nadine's supervision, but she refused to disappear entirely. She insisted on giving technical clarity to investigators, calmly, precisely, like a person finally paying a debt with interest. Ruth published the full investigation in stages, not to sensationalize, but to keep it alive long enough that no one could quietly bury it. Her tone was firm, her facts clean, and her closing line made more than one powerful person choke on their morning coffee. Caleb went back to the lake. Because the lake didn't care about court dates. The lake cared about storms and people who thought they could outrun cold water. Maybelle kept her diner open and her door unlocked, the way a lighthouse keeps shining even when no one is looking. She became a kind of harbor for the shaken, coffee for the sleepless, pie for the grieving, and quiet company for the ones who didn't know how to ask for help. Graham did what Graham did when he didn't know how to live with his own heart. He worked. Agent Park connected him with a regional search and rescue coordinator, Captain Jonah Sutter, a lean man in his 40s with sandy hair, a sun-lined face, and eyes that carried the bright exhaustion of someone who'd spent years pulling strangers out of the worst day of their lives. Jonah spoke fast, laughed easily, and carried tragedy like a backpack he refused to set down. At their first meeting, Jonah looked Graham over, boots, worn gear, calm posture, and nodded toward Coda. You come as a pair? Graham's expression stayed flat. He goes where I go. Jonah grinned. Good. Dogs make better supervisors than humans. Coda blinked slowly, as if hearing the compliment and filing it under. Correct. Jonah offered Graham a role training rescue volunteers. Navigation, cold exposure, trauma response, water survival, not war, not deployment, not the old world of ghosts and gunfire. Something else. something that used the same skills to keep people breathing. At first, Graham almost refused, because choosing to stay meant choosing to be seen, and being seen meant risk. But then he watched Coda on a training day, calmly guiding a panicked teen away from the waterline, nudging a trembling older woman to sit, placing his body between fear and collapse the way only an animal can, without ego. Coda didn't care what Graham had been. Coda cared what Graham chose now, so Graham chose. He stayed. The town began to tell new stories about Coda, half joke, half reverence. Kids called him the harbor guardian. Old fishermen pretended they weren't comforted when he sat nearby during rough weather. Someone even painted his likeness on a small sign by the docks. Coda seemed mildly offended by the artistic liberties. "He's famous," Caleb said one morning, watching Coda stare at the sign like it had personally insulted his ancestry. Graham deadpanned. "He's going to demand royalties in beef." Coda sneezed once, as if in agreement. On the last morning of the Aida season's first real warmth, Graham and Coda walked the shoreline. No pursuit, no hiding, no running. Just footsteps on damp sand and the quiet hush of waves that sounded, for once, like forgiveness trying to learn the shape of a name. Graham's past wasn't erased. His mistakes didn't dissolve. The lake didn't magically cleanse guilt. It only reflected what stood before it. And today, it reflected a man and a dog, both scarred, both stubborn, both alive, choosing not to be dragged by fate, but to step toward something better. Coda trotted ahead, then circled back, brushing Graham's leg with his shoulder as if saying, "Keep up. The world isn't going to walk itself." Graham's lips curved into something almost like peace. The water shimmered under the sun, bright as a blessing. And if any gods were watching, they didn't thunder or intervene. They simply looked on, quiet and amused, as two cracked creatures decided, without drama, without spectacle, to become a home for each other. That, in the end, was the bravest kind of ending. Not the kind that closes a book, the kind that opens a life. Sometimes the miracle isn't thunder in the sky or a door flung open by fate. Sometimes the miracle is quieter. A steady dog who refuses to move, a wounded man who chooses to stay, a small town that finally stops looking away. In Graham and Coda's story, the lake never erased the past, yet God still made a path forward across it, one honest step at a time. The lesson is simple but not easy. Your pain doesn't disqualify you from purpose. Your mistakes don't cancel your future. Healing often arrives the way spring does in the north, slow, cautious, and stubborn. And when you feel like you're sinking, God may not pull you out with spectacle. He may send you a guardian in ordinary clothing, a friend who checks on you, a stranger who tells the truth, a routine that keeps you standing, or even an animal whose loyalty reminds you that you're still worth saving. Everyday life gives us the same choice Graham faced: to keep running from what hurts, or to stand still long, enough to become someone safer, kinder, braver, to speak up when silence feels convenient, to protect what's right even when it costs something, to build a home inside ourselves again, one decision, one morning, one breath at a time. If this story touched you, let it be more than a moment. Share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment telling where you're watching from and what part stayed with you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, because sometimes the reminder you need arrives in the very next video. And for everyone watching, may God bless you with strength when you feel weak, peace when your mind won't rest, and guidance when you can't see the next step. May He protect your home, your loved ones, and the quiet battles you fight when no one is looking. And may you remember this. Miracles still happen, often in the simplest forms, when you choose not to give up.